We're going to be discussing democracy and development and different ideas and theories and hypotheses on whether or not societies become more democratic or have a tendency towards democracy as they become more economically developed. We're going to be discussing democracy and development. Oh, sounds like the audio is coming through. Okay, perfect. All right, we did start about a minute early so we can test the audio out. Thank you for waiting, everyone. Better mute that. Cool. All right, well, hey, what's up, Klaw?
Doing pretty good. You're doing well.
Yeah, doing well, doing well. Just a relaxing day. Hung out with a couple friends yesterday, and been watching Firefly this morning, and doing a little bit of research on different theories on democracy and democratization in the developing world.
Nice. Yeah. Most of what I'm gonna go through, I guess, is really just from other YouTubers that I've had playing in the background in the past. Because I'm definitely no expert on this. My line of work isn't in uh political science or politics in general, really. It's just an interest I've had for a long time.
Yeah, same here. I'm not a political scientist or an expert, but I do find it an interesting conversation, and we actually had this conversation in person, actually at a restaurant, believe it or not. Um, Back a while ago, and we thought it was an interesting conversation we could bring on air. And you suggested we bring it on air, so we can talk about it live. So where do you want to start? Obviously, I think we have some different views here on the tendency towards regimes or the proclivities towards regimes to democratize as they become more developed.
Well, I think my views mostly line up with yours, but there are some caveats that I had outlined that I think before it sounded like you hadn't thought about before or maybe hadn't known about before, but overall on the base level, I do think our views kind of align. Um, so I guess first of all, you when you first brought up this discussion, you said as economic as societies prosper economically, they're more likely to democratize and having thought about it more since our last discussion, I do mostly agree, but I think the thing that has to happen is that society which is seeing more economic prosperity also has to have a fairly strong civil society built up, because it's difficult to have a well-functioning liberal democracy without a good civil society.
Yeah, I don't think we would necessarily disagree on that. I do think there's obviously democracy is extraordinarily complicated. This is one of the most studied topics in political science. How do you transform a regime from an autocratic one into a democratic one? It's also one that's been tried successfully many times, unsuccessfully many times, and resulted in a large number of anocracies or hybrid regimes throughout history, including many today. So it's extraordinarily difficult to get right. There's so many different factors. I think that having a strong civil society is probably maybe not a prerequisite towards democratization. I'm not sure there are prerequisites towards democratization, but there are certainly things that make it more likely or less likely to be successful. And having a civil society, having functional institutions, even within an autocratic regime, I think also can help build democracies and make a democracy more responsive. Uh, I was actually reading today, and it seems like the consensus does seem to be that institutions play which is sort of my prior, that institutions play an extraordinary role in the transition from a autocratic state into a democratic one. At least if you're talking about if you're talking about a regime that's going from something like a hybrid regime or an autocracy, say Taiwan, for instance, or South Korea, that if you have functioning institutions, or even the decolonialization movement in Africa, um, the states that had functioning institutions that were broadly non-corrupt or largely non-corrupt, um, and functioned efficiently, were able to make the transition easier than those that had very corrupt institutions or had large-scale problems with inefficiencies.
Well, yeah, that's part of what plays into the whole civil society thing. Strong institutions are usually a sign of, or I guess usually a part of a strong civil society. And
True. Well, so we both are more or less in agreement that civil society and institutions matter, that some degree of economic development matters. What other factors do you think matter, or do you think that we're missing out on?
um,
Well, political culture, I think, would be one to throw it out there.
yeah, I was I was I was also trying to tie in a lack or a low amount of perceived corruption because but we you kind of brushed over it in the institutional aspect, so I wasn't sure. um it was a little difficult to bring up because it seemed like a rehash of what you were saying. But if we wanted to talk about how damaging corruption is, I could kind of point you in a direction of of a video I saw that basically goes over how if if corruption is unchecked, how it can make it much harder for strong institutions to develop.
Yeah, if you want to lay out the framework too. And there's also probably caveats in the sense that there's different types of corruption, and that probably not all types of corruption are equally detrimental towards the development of, well, economic growth or even a democratic political culture.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if I can really call this corruption as most people know it. It is a form of corruption, but I think most people would define corruption um, as more revolving around economics. What I'm gonna go into is actually talking about uh, political loyalty and also how institutions may not necessarily function for the benefit of the state. Sometimes they compete against each other for political favor instead. And so so how I first got really interested in this was through the Ukraine war and why Russia was doing so badly. It's not just that their military is failing and has been poorly maintained. It's that the the institutions leading the military and the various combat forces like the Wagner PMC or the militias in Donetsk and Luhansk, how all of them, they don't function cohesively. They're all kind of competing against each other for Putin's favor. Do you kind of understand what I'm getting at here?
Oh, sure. It's common within autocratic regimes, I believe, for there to be different competing, basically de facto paramilitaries to, in theory, reduce the chances of a coup. Independently operating organizations with their own de facto armed forces, essentially.
Yeah. So, and before I really get into all this, I should also point out nothing that I say, or even nothing that I say from other people, is necessarily definitive. A lot of this is more saying that this seems to be this way, or this appears to be this way. Because if I say this is this way, I'm probably going to get sued, even if we're just anonymous people on the internet. um, so So back when we were first talking, we had kind of discussed how Russia had a brief taste of or a brief attempt at democracy in the immediate years following the fall of the Soviet Union. And and what I think some people don't take into account is that even though there might have been elections that were, I think back then they were considered free and fair, but I'm not 100% sure about that.
Uh, it, so probably free but not fair, but in the sense that there doesn't appear to have been widespread electoral fraud, but state resources were used to benefit both sides. Actually, if you look at like, I was just out of curiosity, I was doing research, not related to this conversation, just out of curiosity, I was doing research on Yeltsin and the decline of democracy in Russia. And it appears that there were state resources from the Russian state that were pro Yeltsin, whereas from the Soviet state, because Russia was a federated subject within the Soviet Union, from the Soviet state that were actually anti Yeltsin. But broadly, the election was more or less free or fair. Free and fair, you could say. There were multiple competing interests um, putting their thumb on the scale at various points for both sides. But yeah, sure. It was probably one of the freest and fairest elections Russia's ever had. I don't know if you want to. I don't know. I'm not as familiar with the Russian Republic era or the late Tsardom to really talk informed about that, about the early experiments in democracy there. But in terms of the post-Soviet era, it's probably the most free and fair election that Russia had.
Yeah. Um, so during those years, even or despite the freer elections, the society itself or the political state itself was still widely corrupt, and there wasn't really any attempt to clean it up, to clean up that corruption. Instead, what happened was that um, first of all, you had the oligarchs forming, basically taking control or privatizing all the previously nationalized resources, but also within Yeltsin's own administration, he basically kind of did what Putin and really what every Russian politician appears to have done since antiquity, where, or maybe not antiquity, but since the Mongol invasion, let's say, Yeltsin basically appeared to have picked yes men, people who were loyal to him, not people who were most competent. And as time has gone on, it's just been more and more of that. And when you have people incompetent running things, the public is obviously they're going to be unhappy with the administration, but then also when everyone kind of knows that you have to be corrupt, that you have to kiss someone's feet in order to get up on the political ladder, no matter how competent you actually are, it just perpetuates the cycle of corruption. And Russia being cut off from the West for so long has kind of prevented really strong anti-corruption measures to take place, because even before the Soviet Union was existed during the Tsarist era or the imperial era and the immediate years after the Mongol invasion, Russia has never really been tied to the rest of Europe all that much. They've tried to say they're European, but they've always been treated as one of the sick men of Europe. I think the Ottomans were the other group that were considered the sick men of Europe. But the difference is that is that the Ottomans, or really more specifically the Turkish under Ataturk, they they managed to create not really a perfect democracy, but still kind of uh, a more democratic state, while Russia has even when they have a brief experiment, they seem to backslide pretty quickly. Whereas Turkey, they haven't had as much of an issue with that. It's only been an issue more recently with Erdogan, but with Russia, it's been an issue since forever. And and I don't know if you know about this, but have you heard of the Russians' apparent pride for their culture of suffering?
I've not heard it described that way specifically, but I think I'm vaguely familiar with how the Russian pessimism in their culture.
Yeah. So that's been part of Russia for centuries, really since the formation of the Russian state. There's there seems to be a common joke in the East Slavic world that this is the East Slavic world and happy endings are banned. Um, so Russia has a seems to have a deep cultural issue where everyone's just kind of used to suffering. They don't seem to to have this notion that if they get involved in that they can get involved in politics to maybe better themselves. They just take it as, oh, this is just more of the same. What's the point in changing it? And that's why that seems to be why a lot of people just line up with the oligarchs and with the authoritarians, because there's this idea that there's not much they can do. This is just the way it is. This is how it's always going to be. Why change it?
Well, it is interesting too because I think going back to Yeltsin, again, I'm not an expert on Yeltsin's administration by any stretch, but it does seem like there were a number of different. It seems like one, you did have institutions that were corrupt, yes, under the Soviet Union, but were also broadly more or less able to deliver um, on whatever their mission was. I think it's safe to say that the Soviet Union, despite being an extraordinarily corrupt regime, was also one that did have like a degree of competency within it. Um, and that's why they were a major superpower. They lasted so long, and also that they did have the beginnings of a democratic culture in the later years of the Soviet Union, early years of the Russian Federation, where you did seem to have a large number of political parties sprout up, a large number of civil society organizations sprout up, including like fringe independence movements. You see like Chechnya, and I think was it Tatarstan, and there was another one as well where they declared independence. Like just wild things happening all at once within Russia, and so you see like it seems like you have institutions that were semi-functional, and you had a civil society that was beginning to form. So why didn't the Russian democratic project happen? And I think there's a number of different explanations for it. Part of it is that the corruption was just so vast and it was a different kind of corruption, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, and once you started to see the oligarchs basically taking over state resources, as you said, but also too that the electoral system and the former ideology of communism severely hampered any real opposition within Russia, because you had this permanent block of people, uh, that's like 30% of the population, that was basically die-hard communists still. They were the hardliners, and they were never going to accept anything but communism. And so they took up way too much of the electoral space in a first past the post system, which didn't allow for the formation of realistic opposition to whatever the vanguard main party was at the time, allowing for basically non-competitive elections.
That's possible. I don't actually know all. I'm not actually terribly familiar with the actual electoral process in the years after the Soviet fall. I only really know the the some details about Yeltsin's administration and the power games that politicians were playing back then. I'm not really familiar with the electoral process and the electoral or political culture at the time. But I think what also should be remembered is that the Soviet Union was again a union of, I think, about 15 different nations that all kind of went independent afterwards. So even though a lot of people equate the Soviet Union with Russia, in a lot of aspects that's not necessarily true, because some of the aspects, or some of the regions closer to Western Europe, like the Baltic states, Ukraine, even Belarus to some extent, seem to have more familiarity with Western political norms, whereas Russia proper doesn't seem to have that.
Well, is that true for Belarus?
In some respects, yes, because they they do not like Lukashenko. Do you remember back in 2020 there were protests against Lukashenko?
I was actually going to bring that up.
And
yeah.
the main reason they were quashed was because of how deeply tied Belarus is to Russia. The two states are tied in something called a union state. The people themselves don't seem as enthusiastically tied, though. Like Belarusians and Russians, they don't seem to have similar political cultures, and that might also be part of the reason why Lukashenko is he hasn't been as gung ho about falling in line with Putin as some people would think. Like he'll let Russian troops station themselves in Belarus, but he won't actually commit Belarusian troops to invading Ukraine. And the general perception seems to be that if Lukashenko ever ordered it, the people would, or actually first the military just wouldn't follow them, and with the Russian military busy in Ukraine and the Belarusian military just not obeying orders, the people might have a greater chance of actually overthrowing Lukashenko, and Lukashenko potentially knows this, which is why he won't fully commit to a politically destabilizing situation like an invasion of Ukraine.
No, I agree. I think that's the same reading of Lukashenko that I have. Because he knows that he's right now in a very precarious situation. He just had a massive, massive civil unrest just a few years ago to topple his regime. He had to pull out all the stops essentially and get Russian backing to put down the rebellion, essentially. And he has a contested government de jure that won the election that he refused to leave power in, contesting his claim right now with a large undercurrent of the population that is leaning towards democracy and willing to fight for it. So he doesn't want to rock the boat and doesn't want to do anything that will destabilize his own internal power structure. I agree.
Yeah, and it's I think it's also worth noting that Belarus and Ukraine have, before they were under Russia, they were under the influence of some more Western political powers. Like Western Ukraine used to be part of the Austrian Empire. All of Ukraine and Belarus used to be part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and the entire Kievan Rus, the first semi-centralized East Slavic state, or not even central, not even semi-centralized, the first real attempt at an East Slavic state had fairly strong ties with the Byzantine Empire. There, the this East Slavic state, or the development of this East Slavic state into a proper European power, though, was arguably disrupted by the Mongol invasion. There seems to be this general perception that the Mongol invasion and the influence it left on Russian political culture has kind of prevented proper institutions from arising, because in Ukraine and Belarus they're under a more westernized, not truly Western. I don't know if you can really call the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth a Western European power. For nothing else, its geography definitely wasn't in Western Europe, but they have more experience, more of a history with Western European liberal political institutions than Russia has had under the leadership of Moscow.
Well, I do want to question this a little bit. I'm not sure that Russian political history has been hampered by the Mongol invasion, or really anything going back that far. I don't think that the roots of democracy and democratization require several hundred years of not even liberal in this case or Enlightenment uh, societies or cultures. I mean, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth may have been slightly more liberal than the average autocratic regime at the time, but uh, only in the sense of it being more oligarchic by and large. It wasn't exactly a liberal democracy as we would think of it.
Absolutely not. Uh, I mean, you're right. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is absolutely not a a truly liberal um, uh, European state. Like they still had a monarchy, a class of nobles that decided everything, but at the same time, they, like, compared to, as I said before, and I think as you acknowledged, they were freer than whatever happened to Moscow and the Mongols, and but more specifically on the Mongols and what some people call the root of Russian authoritarianism. Um, I'm so I'm actually going to refer you to this video that maybe you can post in chat. I'll send it to you on Discord real quick.
I mean, if it's short, we can even watch it on air. But
It's definitely not short. I think it's 20 minutes. Give me a minute. Yeah, it's 21 minutes. I'll just
you can post it in the Discord chat, and I'll post it in the YouTube chat too if anyone wants to see it.
Yeah, let's see. I just put it in the general chat for Discord.
Okay. All right, I'll go ahead and link it in the YouTube chat too if anyone wants to check it out.
Yeah.
Ugh. But anyway, yeah. Sorry. But why do you think that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, having control over, say, Ukraine and Belarus, even for a relatively brief period of time, why would that? Why do you think that that had a major impact on democratization in Russia, or the democratization in these societies versus in Russia, as opposed to? Oh, it's from crowd. Okay. but as opposed to it being the case that all these societies were more or less on the same footing and same playing field. At least when we're talking about the Industrial Revolution and the period of time when they've industrialized and experienced Enlightenment, liberal values, and also socialist values and fascist values, which we saw rising in these societies in the late 19th, early 20th century. And that these various different factors could have turned out differently.
It's
They
not
could have played
just
out differently than they did.
it's not just the PLC, the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, having control over Ukraine and Belarus for a couple hundred years that influenced this, but also at the same time, uh, what happened in Russia under the Golden Horde, the Mongols, they were basically cut off from Europe, and I think, like I said, they kind of stayed that way all the way up until the early modern age, I think. At least that seems to be my understanding of it. And so I think I don't think it can be denied that Russia has even less influence from the West as Belarus and Ukraine. Does that make sense?
Well, but the problem I have with this is that by the time they had the influence, they had a fairly significant influence by the late 19th century. And there are most democratic societies on Earth don't appear to have been under this Western European influence at all, or very little. Right? If you're
Say
looking
that
at
last part one
I
more time, please.
a large number of the currently existing democratic societies and open societies on Earth today don't have significant ties to Western Europe, such as Japan, such as Taiwan, South Korea, to some extent Singapore. I mean, even the British colonial subjects were, I think they did benefit from, to some extent, to caveat that statement very heavily, to some extent did benefit from British colonial rule in regards to democratization over that of other empires. But most of the societies that seem to have become democracies, especially in the past, say, 50 years, or 30 or 40 years at least, have done so outside of the Western sphere of influence, by and large. The Western European cultural sphere of influence. To what extent do you think that's important? And also, what do you mean by that?
So with Japan specifically, I'm not sure Japan is a good example because we flat out occupied them and created their constitution for them, and
But it did hold.
It did hold,
And
partially
they
also,
were
I think, because the military class had been thoroughly degutted by the American-backed administration.
but also Japan was a democracy prior to fascism taking hold in the 19 well late 1920s,
Yeah, about that time, I think.
or maybe it was mid 1920s, but yeah, I mean prior to the fascists taking power in Japan, they were also a democracy. They had their own independent experiment with it.
They had sent hundreds of scholars to the West, though, in order to learn in order to learn how they had gotten so successful. If I'm actually remembering uh, my if I'm actually remembering my world history class properly, I think the the Meiji era constitution was heavily um was heavily influenced by, I think, a mix of the Prussian and the British constitutions, although Britain doesn't really have a constitution. But do you understand what I mean?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Yeah. And even then, the emperor still wielded political power within this semi-democratic uh, semi-democratic state that had been developed. But but the main point is a lot of these examples that you're pointing to, they have had some Western influence. Like Japan was. I had just gone through Japan, and Korea and Taiwan. To be fair, I'm not really familiar with Korea's democratization process, but with Taiwan, so the very first leader of the Republic of China that was established in 1911 was his name was Dr. Sun Yat-sen, or Sun Jung-san in Cantonese. He's considered by both communist China and Taiwan as the father of the Chinese Republic. He was educated in Hawaii, I think. He that's where he developed most of his political ideas. And in the late years of the Qing dynasty, he basically tried to bring those ideas over. The problem is that there weren't really strong institutions in place. There were a lot of warlords that basically just broke China apart into several warlord districts, I guess, and the democratization experiment was kind of set back several decades and eventually failed because of the communists. And in Taiwan, it almost kind of looked like it failed too because of how authoritarian Chiang Kai-shek was.
Yeah.
But as I said in our discussion in person a while back, Taiwan Taiwan successfully democratized, I would argue largely because they had become a political pariah. Not necessarily pariah in the negative sense that they were an unfriendly state. I mean, they just lost all international support because of the realpolitik games that had been going on with China, the Soviet Union, and the U.S. under Nixon.
No, I mean, and when we talked in person, I said I partly agree. I mean, obviously there was a widespread democratization movement in Taiwan against the regime, and the internal forces within it were not opposed to it enough that they were willing to allow it to happen and allow a gradual transition from the authoritarian state of Chiang Kai-shek after he died into a democratic state. And partly that was due to the fact that America wasn't going to support them unless they democratized, or at least it was becoming less likely that America would back them up if they remained an authoritarian pariah state, as you said. But that was only one factor among many that led to them, and I don't think it was even the necessary factor.
Right. Okay.
Do you think it was the necessary factor? That if
I think it was a major contributing cause, but probably not the necessary factor. There was already kind of a history of of some democratic aspects within the Taiwanese constitution at the time. It was just that the constitution was effectively put on hold under, I think the official term was under the era of communist rebellion or something like that.
yeah, the martial law, yeah.
Yeah. Um, but going back to your point about you said you were skeptical that something so far back could have had like such a big impact on Russia's political development, right?
Well, and I'm not sure that this idea that Russia was cut off from the West is even accurate. I mean, Lenin launched his rebellion. Well, he launched the February Revolution literally from, uh, or I guess he didn't launch the February Revolution. He launched the November Revolution, or was it the sorry? He launched the Second Revolution in 1917
Yeah.
from
October
Europe.
Revolution
From
is
well,
what you're
I mean, he
thinking
was
of.
living in October Revolution. He launched it literally from what, Paris, or was it Switzerland?
He was detained in Switzerland for. Oh, excuse me. Sorry, I'm drinking something as we're talking. Um, he was detained in Switzerland. I don't think imprisoned, just kind of kept in Switzerland. For a law for I don't know how long. I just know he ended up there somehow and couldn't leave. And then Germany, Imperial Germany, while trying to destabilize Russia. This was
Yeah, they
before
let him
the
in. They let him. They
yeah
smuggled him through Finland. Yeah.
yeah they smuggled him in um back into Russia. Um, Now that happened before the treaty with Russia was signed, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk or whatever it was called, which ended the war on the Eastern Front. But but either way, Lenin was back in Russia and creating his revolution. Yes.
But both him and a large number of the other influential Soviet leaders were all, well, not all, but a lot of them were educated in the West and lived in the West in exile for long periods of time, and not just Soviet leaders too, but basically anyone who was opposed to the ancien regime in Russia. A large portion of them were sent exiled and lived in the West.
Right. Yeah. Um. Uh. That's that's a fairly recent development, though. I'm like over the years from between I think 1240 was when the Mongols invaded to about let's say around the I think I'd say around the 1800s or 1700s. Um, Russia was still uh largely confined to its own little sphere. Actually, I won't even say as far as the 1700s. I think from 1240 to 1547 or so is generally considered the years of the Golden Horde, the when the Mongols were in control of Russia. And then from 1547 to around 1721, I think, was the early early not imperial era, because I think the Russian Empire was established in 1721, but from 1547 around that time was when the Prince of Moscow declared himself Tsar of Russia, basically because he had conquered I think all the neighboring Russian principalities and so on. So 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 this so Russia's integration with the West really started around the early the probably around the early 1700s when they beat when they beat the Swedes in the Great Northern War and established themselves as a as a continental power in Europe. I mean, compare integration with the West in about the 1700s to these other states that have, I think by then had the Enlightenment had already started, the Renaissance and everything. Enlightenment's obviously not part of the Renaissance, but I think the political themes that had been established were still or relatively similar. Do you agree with that?
I would have to do way more research to say one way or the other. Sorry,
Okay.
but the greater exploration and emphasis upon art may carry with it some sort of emphasis upon the individual, and so to some extent the Renaissance may have encouraged also a greater degree of literacy in society. So I mean, like, yeah, sure, there were some things that were connected, but I don't know enough to say that they were necessarily how intertwined they were. But sure, for the sake of it, I'll accept it. Sure.
Yeah, it's yeah, my knowledge of the Renaissance is kind of fading a little bit because it's been so long since I've actually
Me too.
gone back and
So
studied it. but but you understand my main point is that Russian integration with the West has been has been much more recent compared to with the other uh with the other European powers. Like
um, I I don't know my Russian history, especially prior to the late 19th century, that well. But my general predisposition would probably be to agree with you. Just my priors would align that way. Now I don't know if there was a greater degree of connectivity. I mean, there obviously Russia was a major player in the Napoleonic Wars, and the various coalitions that took place against France. So I don't. I mean, I don't know how integrated they were necessarily.
yeah, okay.
Well, why do you want to lay out why you? Well, you've already said why you think they weren't because of the Mongol invasion, right?
Yeah, and also
But
the
why didn't do we see an earlier post-Mongol
that
connection?
invasion from the Mongols also um the effects it had on Russian institutions is that do you remember your history teacher saying that Russia had basically practiced feudalism all the way up until like the 1800s, I think to the time of Alexander II
I think it
when he
was
was
even.
Tsar
I
of
think it was
Russia.
up until like the 20th century. I think, right?
I don't think it was that far. I think if I remember properly, emancipation of the serfs in Russia happened at around the same time as the emancipation of the slaves in the U.S. I don't think those two events are tied. It's just a very funny coincidence.
Yeah,
Um,
I could have sworn there was. I could be wrong.
well, keep in mind also that this is the official
Okay.
emancipation when
No,
it
I
was
think you're
announced.
okay.
And
According to Wikipedia, it's 1861. Well, there were prior acts that had limited it. Looks like over like the 50 years well, even a couple centuries prior. Um, there were some minor reforms that had reduced the number of serfs in the country. But it does look like 1861 roughly was the formal about abolition. Oh,
yeah,
hang on, but it was okay. D
functionally speaking, though, the
yeah,
emancipated serfs were still so poor that they were still kind of not much had really changed for them. They were
yeah.
still tied to the land and to the nobility. I think they were called the boyars, but I don't know for sure.
Okay, the serfs had to work for the landlords as usual for 2 years. The nobles kept nearly all the meadows and forests, had their debt repaid by the state, while the ex-serfs paid 34% over the market price for the shrunken plots of land they kept. This figure was 90% in northern regions, 20% in the Black Earth region, but zero in Polish provinces. In 1857, 6.79%. Okay, so yeah, it looks like it was abolition, but kind of in name only. I mean, we had our own experience here with tenant farmers, right? After
Something,
sharecropping, I'm sorry.
yeah, something like that, probably. I don't. Uh, my knowledge of that is a little sketchy.
I
Um,
posted the thing I was reading out. It's a Wikipedia. I just got off from Wikipedia. I don't know how, but that yeah, because I remember there was the the peasant class was still very, very much a class well into the 20th century.
Yeah. Um, and that's partly the reason why Lenin adopted the tenets of Marxism, but tried to rework them into Russian society by making it a like farmer or peasant rebellion,
Well,
sort
no,
of.
it was. I mean, so from my understanding, this could be wrong, but from what I've read, I think yes, he did rely. The Bolsheviks did rely to some extent on peasant support, but this was always secondary, and they always wanted that Lenin believed that that you had to have some degree of industrialization in order to have um, socialism and Marxism and communism. So he most of his support base came from soldiers and came from the industrial classes, with very little focus on the agrarian classes. I believe he even gave the agrarian classes, the rural areas, less of a vote within the parliament. Or
Yeah,
is that not true?
that wouldn't surprise me, but like it's worth I think it's worth acknowledging that that Lenin basically had to adapt Marxism based on the internal developments of Russia at the time.
Oh yeah,
He couldn't take uh, Marx and Engels uh, at excuse me at face value. Like I think I think Marx himself even said, excuse me, sorry. Um, I think Marx himself even said something along the lines of that his ideas were mostly for the substantially industrialized West and not really for developing agrarian societies.
yeah, I believe that was. I mean, that was sort of like the general consensus of most of the socialists, including Marx, right? That basically you couldn't have this in a purely agrarian or largely agrarian society.
Yeah,
Well, I mean, it sort of makes sense, though. I mean, it sort of makes sense, but it might be wrong. It sort of makes sense from the idea that they think that, well, if we want to produce large amounts of abundance in society and to maintain a command economy, assuming you're not a market socialist, but like assuming you want to maintain a command economy, like you need a high degree of industrialization. But ironically enough, it might be agrarian societies that have more of a socialist instinct, like the super small or not even agrarian, but probably hunter-gatherer societies probably have like more of an egalitarian instinct than the industrialized workers would.
yeah, and more of a communal society really, because um, social classes really only emerge from specialization of labor, which is what you get when people figure out. Um, so this is very oversimplified and probably irreverently humorous, but basically society developed because some guy basically said, "Oh, I know of a way to get more food than everyone else. So so if you don't want to waste your lives like hunting and gathering or whatever, come work for me. Tend to the fields that I've made." Um, and then as that kind of carries on, eventually you have enough
Well,
farmers. So then again, as I said, this is very irreverent and oversimplified, but but basically, as this goes on, when you eventually have enough farmers, you need people to manage them, and then eventually you have artisans, you have people in the arts, all that stuff. You know what I mean?
yeah, that is a very commonly held view. I'm not sure if it is unchallenged, because it does seem, if I'm not, so there was this idea that people had that these early hunter-gatherer societies were highly egalitarian, and that does seem to be the case for some of them. But it does seem also like there was some degree of a hierarchy within them too, in some, or at least in some cases. Yuval Noah Harari, have you read his book *Sapiens*?
I have not. This is getting into territory I've never even studied at all
I'm a
before.
total novice here. I've read a little bit. I found it interesting. I did some research on it. Listened to a few podcasts. Like this was like 10 years ago, like 5 years ago though. So I'm way out of date on this stuff. But I believe that they have found hunter-gatherer remains that they believe had uh, uh, ornamentation on them. that they believe signified from at least some tribes had a hierarchical structure where at least there was like a leader um, who probably was revered in some way, possibly even in a religious context. Again, that's not saying that they found this for like one of the tribes. I'm not sure if this we're going back to there's 15,000, 20,000 years or more in human history. So like we're going way far back than most of us know anything. Than we can know much. But I think that they have found that some tribes were highly egalitarian. There's indications of that, but other tribes were more had more of a hierarchical structure, or there was some degree of leadership within the society, even these small hunter-gatherer bands.
Yeah. The only caveat I would raise, or not even really caveat, the only question I would ask about that is that yes, that's evidence of a hierarchy, but is it evidence of specialization of labor, which is really the formation of a centralized society or even
True.
centralized society.
That's a good point. It's not obviously evidence of that. It could be theoretically, but without further information, you could not make that determination. So yeah, there probably wasn't the specialization of labor, other except along the lines of gender, perhaps. But in regards to broader specialization, no. So you had these early kingdoms. Well, we're getting way far afield from the socialism discussion. We, do,
That's always what happens when you have these in-depth conversations.
true, true. And
And when I say you, I don't mean you. I mean you as in people in general.
yeah. Well, it's so funny too because I feel like the number of people that I could have these conversations with on this level is vanishingly small. Is that just me, or does it seem like most people don't?
I mean, I don't know. Personally, like yeah, people are kind of stupid, but at the same time, like you get someone one on one and get someone like relax enough. Um, you'll be surprised at the insight they can um, that you can get from them. I
True.
feel like this
Actually,
happens with
I feel like that's
everyone.
true. I feel like yeah, I've had a large number of conversations with people over the years. Like yeah, if you get them relaxed and it's just a chilling out, hanging out, and then like you bring up some wild topic and you can have a pretty good discussion on it. Though I do find that most people in this specific field, like history, politics, like that sort of field, like most people don't have that much in depth in that specific area, I should say.
I don't know if I can say we really have that much in depth
I don't think we do
knowledge
either,
of it
but
either.
the fact
We're just parroting other people at this point.
true,
I'm
but I don't know. I don't think I'm crazy here. I feel like most of the political conversations I see online are like way less nuanced than what we're doing.
well, yeah, that's online. You and I, we know each other, and we're also speaking, not face to face, but we know each other. We know each other face to
Yeah,
face. I'm okay with saying that online, by the way, and like we're talking
yeah, I am
with
too.
actual voices right now.
Yeah, so
Um,
that's yeah, but yeah, maybe it's just the internet. Because in real life, I feel like if somebody's interested in a topic, they can go for hours on it, in depth, nuance, jump from thing to thing to thing. But it seems like the internet's where this breaks down, and maybe it's because we're interacting with so many different people, and a lot of it's text based, a lot of it's anonymous or pseudonymous, and there's echo chambers involved. Like I don't know.
nuance doesn't carry over in text at all.
Yeah,
Like even now, I'll still get for brief moments, I'll get irrationally angry at something I read online. Like even now, just because of how poor nuance is conveyed.
sure, me too. In fact, I had a conversation recently online that didn't seem to be super hyper productive. And whereas if it was a voice conversation, it might have been, or in person.
Yeah, I
Anyway,
guess going
oh god.
yeah, I guess going all the way back to the original point, democratize or a tendency for societies to develop democracy. Like, um, well, first, when you have 20 minutes, or you have just a task that'll take you 20 minutes, play that video from Kraut in the background and kind of see what you think about it. Um,
Well,
about the
I
notion
might
that
watch
some
it on air, or I might watch it on my own. But I
yeah,
don't feel like we have to watch a. If you want to summarize the main points within, we can discuss it
I
now.
mean, he basically, so he starts off by saying usually in societies that have been conquered, the conquerors just end up adopting the customs of and institutions of the places they conquered. Like, um, the Normans adopted the practices of the of the Anglo-Saxons. Um, like, even though they brought a lot of Norman institutions with them, they all kind of adapted to what the Anglo-Saxons had at the time. In China, the Mongols who invaded China ended up just adopting Chinese customs, um, and um, the Germanic tribes that invaded Rome. Um, to some degree, they just adopted the Roman institutions too. Like, Germany was called
Sure.
the Holy Roman Empire for a time.
Well, and the Romans were extraordinarily successful with this because they would, even with the religions, what is it, syncretism they call it? They would just like adopt local customs and add them officially into their religion now, merge them together basically.
Yeah. Um, and Kraut basically says with Russia the opposite happened. The Mongols didn't adopt the institutions of the Kievan Rus. The Russians adopted the warrior mentality of the, or not really well, kind of warrior mentality if you think about how imperialist they were. Um, they adopted the warrior mentality of the Mongols basically, and then when the Mongols hired the Russian princes as tax collectors, they appear to have um, just just kind of made their states all about uh, all about extracting as much as possible from their people, and um,
What do you not? Obviously, you can answer this however you want. You don't believe in like historical materialism?
what is this?
Historical materialism?
Explain it,
Like the
please.
Marxist theory of history, that all of history is essentially a class struggle where you have extractive institutions uh, and well groups utilizing every resource at their disposal, including institutions and state power, to extract as much wealth as they can out of any subordinate group, such as the lower class, for instance. To be clear, I
Um,
don't believe it. I'm just curious what you think.
I actually hadn't really, well, I hadn't really thought about it that much. I mean, I now that you explain it, I think I have heard the theory. Um, I don't know. I can't really comment on it because I haven't thought about it all that much
Okay.
really. Um, yeah, but then with with uh with Russia under the Mongols, because they had basically become tax collectors to the Mongols when the Russians eventually took back power um, in their respective principalities and duchies. They kind of carried those institutions to the people they conquered. They basically, the Russian nobility basically became uh, tax collectors for the Tsar, which was established in Moscow. Basically, they didn't readopt the old the old institutions of the Kievan Rus, and kind of as a kind of as a counterpoint to that, like, yeah, um, If you look at the regions of the Kievan Rus that weren't conquered by the Mongols, you have uh, Ukraine and Belarus, which were incorporated into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which compared to other monarchies at the time was fairly more liberal
Yeah,
than
it was. Yeah,
yeah.
significantly so. In fact, I'd say. Yeah.
And then you also have up in the north the Novgorod Republic that if what Kraut says is true, I don't want to take take Kraut's words as gospel um because it's just one guy and who probably knows way more than I do, but again, it's just one guy. I don't want to believe in one source as gospel. So
Oh, for sure.
even though I'm repeating his points, I should say like there's plenty of room for counterpoints to this. But his his analysis of his highlight of the Novgorod Republic was basically that it was much more similar uh, to the states of the West, where the Prince of Novgorod was accountable to to his nobles. Um, the some members of the nobility were elected by the citizens. There were representative bodies in society, and all of that basically got destroyed when Muscovy or Russia invaded and conquered Novgorod. And then they basically imposed their institutions on Novgorod instead of the other way around, where they adopted the regional institutions. Basically, it just became an endless cycle of instead of the nobility holding the monarch accountable, the monarch basically held the nobles accountable by pitting them against each other, because I think the tax policies at the time were something along the lines of whoever can extract the most from their peasants and whoever can prevent the most peasants from leaving their lands would earn more favor with the Tsar.
Yeah, I know nothing about the Novgorod Republic, unfortunately. Aside from the name, basically, I've heard before. Now, I do want to take it a little bit back to when we were talking in person about this. I asked you if you would have been surprised, say 30 years ago, if Ukraine was going to become a democratic republic, and you said, I believe that you said that you would have been shocked by that, or 40 years ago, let's say, 1980.
Yeah, I think back then, uh, well, yeah, I think back then I would have been shocked. Mostly because I would have fallen into the same trap as thinking, oh, the Soviets are just the Russians. It's not a union of 15 different republics with their own internal cultures and internal desires.
But you don't think that a democratic revolution like we saw in Ukraine or in Georgia or the other Eastern European bloc countries, that or in Taiwan and South Korea, um, that we would not, it would be virtually impossible or very unlikely. You consider
I
it
would I
almost
would have
impossible for that to happen in China or Russia. Sorry, just
I'd
what.
say it's all I'd say it's at the China I'm a little up in the air about. But for Russia I'd still say it's within our generation probably impossible or close to impossible. Um
What do you
um
say in our generation? Like, what do you mean, like in our lives?
Not necessarily in our lives. Like I usually define a generation as 20 to 30 years. That's usually how long it takes for someone who was just born to become a functioning member of society and politically enfranchised and all that stuff. Um, um, I the reason I say it's I don't like to use the word impossible, so I'm just going to say very difficult. The reason I say it's very difficult for Russia, based on what I as an idiot who's not an expert knows, is the institutions in Russia right now, they don't favor competency and um, they don't favor politicians who are competent and who listen to the people. They favor politicians who are subservient to the head of the government, which is Putin in this case. and they don't the institutions don't favor cooperation between the different aspects of society. They actively pit them against each other. So right now with the war going on, it's become especially clear lately because you have the head of the Ministry of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, the head of Wagner, Prigozhin. Yeah. I was trying to remember his first name, but I don't remember it for some reason. And also the head of Chechnya, Kadyrov. They they all kind of, on some degree, hate each other, and this is actually fairly common in authoritarian nations. In Nazi Germany, you had the Waffen SS and the Heer, which was the paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party, the Waffen SS, I think, and the Heer is the German word for army. So the Nazi paramilitary and the army itself, they would always try and one up each other. They hated each other, and in Imperial Japan too, Imperial militarist Japan, I should say, in World War II, you had the Imperial Japanese Army and the Imperial Japanese Navy, both of which hated each other. They all operated their own independent armies, air forces, and navies to some extent. Like they were completely independent of each other, and they all hated each other. That's why military leadership well, I'm a little hesitant to say Japan for sure, just because I haven't read as much about it. But military leadership in Nazi Germany was honestly kind of a mess. They themselves were shocked at some of the victories they had pulled off in the early years of the war, because of how much stronger they thought the rest of the West would be. And in modern Russia, you're just seeing the same thing. And to especially nail this home with Sergei Shoigu, who's Minister of Defense, and I'm going to put another link in the Discord for you,
sure.
where I got this info from. Sergei Shoigu, considering the failures of the Russian military, one would probably think that he's incompetent. Do you agree with that?
Him specifically? I mean, yeah, based on what I've seen, yes.
Yeah. So
that would be my assumption.
Yeah, that's what most people in the West think, because he's kind of rolled back a lot of the reforms that the last guy wanted to do. I don't remember his name. But yeah, Shoigu has a good relationship with the military, a good relationship with the military-industrial complex, and a good relationship with Putin. That's all he cares about, supposedly, and and that's why his only goal is to maintain that loyalty to Putin, because that that in response will allow him to keep his job. By Western standards, Shoigu is utterly incompetent, but by Russian standards, he's an amazing politician. He's served in every government since Yeltsin, all the way back to the 90s, and he has survived every purge. He's survived every political upheaval in the post-Soviet state, and that's what Russian institutions seem to favor at the current moment. They're less about the will of the people and more about the will of the head of government.
Well, do you? I mean, in some ways, I think America probably. I mean, Western societies generally probably do have a much better job of maintaining professional bureaucracies that are generally competent-ish. But I'm not sure. But on our elected officials, we don't necessarily have a great track record either.
They have a better track record. That's the
And they're
that's what
only in there for a
matters.
short period of time, ideally.
Yeah, that too. That too.
They can go away at any point. Well, it's interesting too. So in this context, do you think that China is? I think China probably is different than Russia in this context. That China has a system that does have a fair amount of corruption, but it's a different kind of corruption, and it's also more meritocratic, significantly so, than the Russian civil service and military and governmental institutions.
That's something Kraut actually brings up in his video that I first linked. He says that I'm a little skeptical that this is as true as he might be making it out to be, but he basically said as you move up the political chain in China, you get less corrupt, and I think there's a lot of caveats to that, but I think on some level it might be accurate. It might be somewhat accurate to say, because a lot of the corruption issues in China seem to be at the regional level. You don't see as much of it on the national level. Do you know what I mean?
Uh, I don't. I mean, I don't know actually. So, but also, is it that there isn't as much, or that we just don't know about it because they're not as willing to throw those people under the bus?
I think it might be a bit of both, but the main point is that China's institutions seem to be, even though they're authoritarian, they seem to be more stable than Russia's. And to some degree, they still do take the people's will into account, but only like under very extreme circumstances. Like the people protested Japgunping, Xi Jinping, but in Cantonese he's called Japgunping. The people's revolt over Japgunping's no COVID policies were kind of successful.
Yeah.
Like the policies were lifted, and yeah, now COVID is a recurring problem in China. That might be a little outdated. I haven't kept track of COVID at all lately, but the main point is, like, Japgunping was willing to have that be the issue rather than the people hating him be the issue. And also, China's political history has developed such that even with horrendously authoritarian and somewhat corrupt institutions, meritocracy has always formed the basis of moving up the political ladder. The civil service exams, the whole meritocratic aspect, that's been a thing since antiquity. since all the way back since the very early Chinese dynasties. So
True.
so like you were a little questioning of the idea, can something from so long ago really have an impact today? I think this is a good example of, yeah, it
Well,
can.
no. To be clear, my argument's not that because it's old. My argument is that the the Mongol invasion and the Kievan Rus's ties to the Byzantine Empire, like these specific things, are so far removed from the Enlightenment era that came several hundred years later that I'm sure it had some degree of impact just as a matter of historical connection. But it seems like we're going awfully far back and drawing some very big conclusions from that.
So I think I should probably, I might have misspoke a little bit by tying it too much to the Enlightenment. I
No,
think it's still
I tied it to the Enlightenment. You didn't tie it that much to it. I was
okay.
more tying it to the Enlightenment, but because I think that I'm not sure that pre-Enlightenment connections between empires, especially going back to like the Byzantine Empire, but the Middle Ages, the not the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, the late
This
Middle
would
Ages,
be the
early
Middle
Middle
Ages.
Ages, yeah, early Middle Ages,
Yeah.
middle. I don't know if going that far back we're going to. I mean, we're going to see that big of a connection to whether or not Russia later became democratic.
It's more
Especially
to
since
do with
so many democracies have arisen that have even a further afield um,
yeah.
connection than
It's
Russia
more
did.
to it's more to do with the institutions that those events had a hand in influencing is really my point.
Okay.
Oh, excuse me. Um, yeah, and part of the reason why, like, the strength of one's institutions plays a large part in how strong the state is in the end. Like, everyone always criticizes the U.S., and rightfully so. I'm not trying to to make excuses for how bad our government has been, but a lot of the reason why the US is successful in the first place with messing around in Latin America is because their institutions have just been so weak. Um, like we've tried messing around elsewhere, and it's they don't always have the same success as in Latin America. You understand what I'm saying?
In regards to what?
Um, but like it's easy for us to it's easy for us to start coups in Latin America because of because their institutions are so weak. Um, but
Oh, sure. During the
but
Cold
I
War, yeah.
yeah,
I mean, I would agree. Sure.
uh, but but there were plenty of other there were plenty of places elsewhere that we uh tried to prop up an authoritarian, and it just failed. Like like Iran's kind of a mixed bag because we were successful with the initial coup, but despite that very strong relationship with the Iranian Shah, we couldn't keep them in power because internal developments in Iran had basically made him untenable as the head of state. Um,
Well, and it's interesting because so obviously Latin America has historically had um, weaker institutions, but today virtually almost all of Latin America, except for Venezuela, Cuba, and what Nicaragua and maybe Honduras, and,
yeah,
are all democracies. So how did they do you think develop? Because if you looked at Latin America 100 years ago, they were almost all, or the vast majority of them, of Latin American countries were authoritarian regimes or something like a hybrid regime. Now they're almost all at least flawed democracies.
yeah. Um, so
Oh, and I
so
guess
your
Haiti
question
too.
is
But
your question basically how did that happen?
well, I mean, because yeah, sure. Why is it that 100 years ago these were all also you could say the same thing about much of Europe too. These were all authoritarian regimes 100 years ago in Europe and Latin America, in Asia, and now in Europe and Latin America, and to some extent in Asia, you're seeing a large number of democracies emerging from these historically authoritarian regimes.
This is a little difficult to answer,
And
and
even Africa too, I'd say actually.
yeah, this
Not,
guy
no, not
this
most in Africa, but a larger percentage than you would think.
this is a little difficult to answer, and I probably didn't even make my previous argument all that well. Like my previous argument is probably highly flawed because my chair just cracked. Um,
Well, we don't have to go for too much longer. It's up to you because I got a friend coming over in a bit. But I have no time limit. He just said text me whenever you're done.
yeah, um, yeah, like my last argument about Latin America having weaker institutions, while that is true, some of the conclusions I might have drawn from that probably are highly flawed, like even at a surface level. But that's kind of what makes this difficult to answer too, because it's not something I've thought about, and my last thing about Latin America having weak institutions, that's something I never really thought about either. I just know that by most standards, Latin America or the conclusions I know that the weak institutions aspect is true, but the conclusions I drew from that are I haven't really put that much thought into them. If I had to guess why there seems to be a trend towards democratization currently, is because no, this is just a shot in the dark. I don't really haven't really properly thought this out. But if I had to make a shot in the dark, probably I'd have to guess maybe it's because of how much states are becoming intertwined with each other, how much they're being influenced, and how much they're being influenced by others, and how much influence they're having on others. Do you know what I mean?
I'm sorry. Could you repeat that?
But if I had to guess why like we're seeing more democracies spring up in like Latin America and Africa, the developing world basically, like it might be because if I had to make a shot in the dark, because I haven't thought about this all that well, it might be because global influence between countries, including the West, is just becoming more prevalent. Like glo- back back in the Cold War, globalization wasn't that much of wasn't hadn't really caught on yet. I think I
Well,
learned
yeah, it
in
caught on
history it was more in the
differently. Well,
70s or 80s that
it
it
seems like
really
it
got
caught
going.
on differently. I think. I mean, I think we saw a great deal of globalization in the early 20th century. In the interwar period, even people thought that there could not be a second world war because the economies of the world were so interlinked. Now those people were wrong, but that was a very commonly held belief back then.
Was it as far back as the interwar period? I thought it was more of a 70s and 80s thing.
No, well, it's been a process over the course of like the past like 200 years, right? Past all of human history, you could argue, but not no, in the interwar period, there was a widespread view, and I think even prior to World War One, there was a view that there wouldn't be major wars, or that there wouldn't be major catastrophic wars on the scale that we saw for sure, because the economies were becoming more interlinked.
I
Like
feel
there's
like with World War One and Two, the idea of World War Three. Well, with
no, I'm serious. I used to look this up because it was
I
very
feel like
much.
the main impotence, the main thing back then preventing World War III was that everyone saw how destructive it, World War One and Two had been,
Well, I
that they
think
didn't want
nuclear
to go through it
weapons.
again.
I think nuclear weapons were the reason we didn't have a World War III. At
Well,
least not yet.
that's part of it too, because of the destruction. Um,
But
but the
but
whole
that's
globalization
not the
and
point I was
economic
making though.
integration, yeah, the whole globalization and economic integration thing, um, like, yeah, you saw it's been a thing for a long time, but I feel like it really only became a really dominant force around the second half of the Cold War, like after the 60s.
Why do you
That's
think that?
my understanding of history.
Why do you think that?
It's mostly because it's just what I remember reading way back in my history class. Um, um, but also a lot of the investments we made into like into Europe and developing countries, that was an ongoing process throughout the 50s, and we started seeing the payoffs in the 60s and afterwards. Um,
Well, I mean, but that is globalization. I mean, the Marshall
yeah,
Plan, the massive amounts of foreign aid, the I mean, direct interventions with World War II, for
yeah,
instance. Like these were all part of the globalized world order,
yeah,
like major aspects of it.
yeah. I know.
So wouldn't that be considered part of globalization?
Yeah, that's my point. I'm just saying the big payoffs of it probably really only started manifesting in the later half of the Cold War.
I mean, maybe. I mean, I don't know if I would say that. What do you mean by they paid off, though?
Like the post World War II economic boom, like um um I guess in Europe the the recovery was faster, but in places like Asia, um especially in Korea, I remember this graph from of North and South Korea compared. North Korea was actually doing better than South Korea up until around the 60s.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, um, North Korea was growing like linearly. South Korea was just stagnant at like a tenth of the North Korea's economic productivity. But then I think in the 60s, when foreign investment was opened, that graph basically went almost vertical in like the next year because investment was so much investment had flooded into Korea, and it was getting a big payoff from that.
Why do you think the student and internal revolution in Beijing in the 80s failed?
Um, If I had to guess, probably just because like relative to the size of the Chinese government, it was just too small. And it's also worth noting the military in China is it's not really a Chinese military, it's a Communist Party military. The military kind of acts as a wing of the Communist Party. It's it's not um, accountable to the civilians like it is in the West, or like the military is in the West.
Huh? And do you think we're going to see another crack at that? Either internal reforms, maybe after Xi Jinping's dead or retired, or perhaps not, or some sort of rebellion or uprising or mass protests that put pressure on the government to initiate certain reforms. Some
Um,
degree of political liberalization that come from it.
I don't know about political liberalization, but economic unrest is, oh, excuse me, is um, economic unrest is it is definitely in China's future because I had mentioned before they were gonna face the beginnings of demographic collapse from the one child policy in probably 10 or 20 years.
Well, this instability in China as a result of their declining demographics is that, well, it's one, do you think it's guaranteed to produce an economic upheaval as opposed to something more like the Japanese situation where they still maintain a high standard of living, but they also are a declining power in terms of population and in terms of, to some extent, economic growth, economic power. Can China, so to put that another way, can China still maintain a high standard of living even with a declining population as Japan has, and arguably Western Europe?
I have to think about that a little more. I want to say no, just out of bias, but I I'd have to take some more time to formulate an argument why I actually think um, China would have greater issues.
Well, I
Um,
think it's more severe because of the one China policy than a natural gradual decline in birth rates like we've seen in Europe and Japan. Also,
yeah,
the Western Europe and the United States are bolstered by well, the United States at least is bolstered by immigration, whereas Japan's not. And we haven't necessarily seen the end of the Japanese story yet. There could be major issues down the line.
yeah. I do wonder also if just economic mismanagement would play a part too, because like China's about to face their own housing bubble crash, and that's where a lot of people have stored their money into. So so I don't know. It's too early to tell, but I'm hesitant to say that they'll turn out the same way the West and Japan did, if that makes sense.
No, I mean I don't place I don't know. I am extremely hesitant to make predictions about the future because it seems like every 30 years the future drastically changes in ways that no one could have ever predicted 30 years prior. Like if you would have said in 1960, in 30 years, the Soviet Union is going to be collapsing. There's going to be a whole bunch of independent countries in Europe gaining their independence and becoming democracies. You're going to see, a democratic Asia in many respects. The large portions of Asia are going to become democracies. Like you'd be like, no, that's not going to happen. But you'd be wrong. If you would have said
Yeah,
in 1930 that in 60 years, 30 years, we're going to be, well, I guess let's say 1940. In 30 years, we're going to have people walking on the moon in less than 30 years, even. They'd be like, no way.
yeah.
And yet here we are. Like the internet, too. It's just, there's so many different massive changes that nobody ever predicted, these black swan events. So I don't know what the future holds for China.
I think a question worth asking also is that um, so China also has a pretty big gender disparity too. Like for every one female, there's 1.3 males or something. I'm kind of curious if Japan and the West, despite well, the West probably not as much, but Japan, I'm kind of curious if Japan has seen a gender disparity like that
Well, the
because
Chinese one was because of
the one child
sex
policy.
selective
Yeah,
abortions, right?
yeah. Um, so that might be an additional source of unrest that Japan and the West haven't seen.
Yeah, it
So
very well could be. Now, are you familiar with Nepal?
the country,
Yeah.
um, a little bit.
Uh, here's a society that went from being a authoritarian monarchy essentially into becoming a democracy with almost no understanding of what a democracy was. They this built it basically with very little outside influence or help. How do you think about that?
I'd have to read more about it. I can't really say anything at the moment because I know so little about it.
Yeah, it's the Nepalese Civil War um, between the Kingdom of Nepal and the communists, and the communists actually won, but strangely, the communists ended up as part of a deal, they ended up having like free and fair elections, and now there's like 15 different communist parties and a bunch of non-communist parties all competing against each other, and they seem to have had a number of different governments now and maintained a democratic system with very little past experience with democracy or very little democratic culture or seemingly any of the things that we think are required. So, are not required, but create the conditions for democracy. They weren't an extremely developed country. Didn't have a high level of development. At least I don't believe so. So it doesn't seem like they weren't very developed. They didn't have a strong civil society as far as we can tell. They seem to have somewhat of a tribal issue where there's tribal divides, which it usually doesn't tend itself towards democracy, and they didn't seem to have good institutions, and yet somehow they managed to create something out of that, which is kind of goes against all of our priors, like this weird seeming exception to both my beliefs and yours on this. Though I mean, our beliefs are both neither of them are absolute rules. Like I think you and I would both say that there are certain predispositions and certain things that make things more or less likely to be successful or fail. But none of them are absolutes, right? That's what I think what we would say.
Yeah,
But
like most of the things that we talk pretty much every major ideology is based on a generalization. There's always exceptions to it.
yeah. Well, hey, is there anything else you want to talk about?
I'm just gonna link one more thing that maybe whoever reads the chat in the future might find interesting.
All right.
Yeah, a critique of realism, but specifically
Oh, this is the one you told me about, right?
but the last third of it, um, where he like really gets into the critique and talks about internal developments is probably what would be most relevant to what you and I were talking about. Everything before that is just about how realism developed and also why he thinks people like Noam Chomsky and other progressive intellectuals are garbage.
Cool. Well, hey, man, thanks for coming on. It was a fun conversation. We could definitely have another one sometime. I feel like there's a lot more we could discover and or to explore. Um, but it was definitely interesting. And I like to have conversations like this. I don't know where it is you're going, that you're having all of these awesome conversations that are on this level, but most of the
This
conversations I seem to have uh, don't are more surface level, and that's not even because like, it seems like most of the people I interact with like don't have a huge knowledge base about history, for instance, or um, especially international relations and political
I kind
history.
of I kind of attribute it to two things. One is my tendency to just play these geopolitical videos in the background while I wash the dishes or something. Um, but the second contributing cause uh, is likely because um, so how do I really say this? My dad is like he has a lot to say about the Communist Party. No, I am not going to bring him on a stream. Absolutely not. Um,
Hey, that'd be fun. I'm down if he wants to.
no, absolutely not. Besides, his English isn't that great.
And that's fun. My
Um,
Mandarin's not great either, so.
ugh. um, but he and I would because I would spend a lot of summers at home. I didn't like have that. I didn't really have summer jobs all that much, which kind of shot me in the foot a bit. But it
Oh,
seems to have
sorry,
worked out.
Cantonese. Sorry.
Yeah, he speaks Mandarin too.
Oh, okay.
Um, yeah. Um, Yeah. Anyway, yeah, I spent a lot of my summers at home. I didn't have many summer jobs, which kind of shot me in the foot a little bit, but it seems to have worked out because my job is pretty good now. Um, but yeah, because I spent so many summers at home, and my siblings were all already having their own lives on the West Coast, like during lunch, he and I would always just talk about just random stuff about because he has a an interest in history too. So he and I would always talk a lot about that stuff. Um,
I have an interest in
so
history
yeah,
three.
so yeah, and he also talked a lot about his like the first decade of his life just growing up the in communist China and seeing how bad things had got. So I think those two things are really why I actually take the time to learn about this stuff. What about
No,
you?
I've always had an interest in it, and so I've just always like sort of like on my own. Mostly did like reading like Wikipedia. I took a lot of classes on political science in college too, because it was something I was really interested in. So a lot of my elective classes were poli sci. I even considered majoring in it at one point, but yeah, it was like a super fascinating topic to me. And also just I have conversations with people in real life sometimes, like with my uncle. He's a very he loves history, he loves politics, he's really smart and loves to talk about different like historical events and stuff like that. So he's taught me a lot,
Okay.
and just a little bit of reading too, but not as much reading as I'd like on the topic. So yeah, it's just sort of an interesting hobby for me. It always has been. But I'm probably gonna head out here soon. Close down the stream. It was an awesome conversation. Uh, you
Yeah,
have any
for
final
sure.
thoughts or anything to bring up, or
What I'd kind of like to do, like as a part two or part three or something, is um maybe you and I can watch snippets of the videos that you and I have linked and like just kind of talk about them, react to them a little bit because you seem to have done that in previous streams
yeah,
too.
I've done a lot of reaction like videos and stuff like the that. Yeah, we can definitely do that. I think there is like watch together you can do. Like we can watch the same YouTube video with other people and stuff. So I think we can do something like that. Yeah.
Okay, nice. Yeah, I think that'd be interesting. That
Even
would
even like within a few days, like if you want to do it on like Monday or Tuesday or something, we can probably do that. Or
uh
I gotta go to the library at some point, so but sometime this week, would be fun. We can talk about that off air. I'm sure the public doesn't want to know all the boring details of how we set things up.
yeah,
But
but
yeah, no, we
but
could definitely do something. And
yeah, and I think that would be a lot more useful for anyone who does watch this too, because what the arguments you and I have articulated, they're on it like we're not experts and they're probably not as well articulated as they could have been. Whereas with these videos that we've both linked, like these people are expert or much better at commentating and like watching them on stream and reacting accordingly would probably
oh, gee, thanks, Claw.
get
What
get
are you trying to say, huh?
we probably both suck at public speaking is what I'm trying to say.
Uh, I'm not sure I'm that bad at it. I 5 years ago, 10 years ago, maybe, but I've gotten better at it. But obviously, it's a skill like anything else.
My main point is that these guys are better experts than we are, so it'd probably be better like to actually play some of their stuff on
I mean, a
stream.
lot of them are just YouTubers too. Like the people, like, I wouldn't say that they are necessarily expert. I mean, these aren't like professors of economics and professors of political science. Like the people you've linked are just other YouTubers that you trust.
They're better at articulating than I think you and I probably are, though. Is probably my better point.
I mean, maybe, sure, probably,
Yeah,
but like I'm
that's
just
kind
saying
of
that they're
why
not. They're just other rando YouTubers too.
that is true. And I
So
myself said I should be careful about taking their words as gospel.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, I think it'd be useful to like listen to a better articulated version of things on stream. is my main point.
Cool. Well, actually, I know Crowd. I could just have him on.
Oh,
Well,
interesting.
I haven't talked to him in like 8 years, so I don't know if he even remembers me. But
Hmm.
yeah, I used to have a connection with him. So
Huh. That's interesting. That'd
I
be
might, I
cool.
might, I might reach out. Um, but anyway, I'm probably gonna go. We're gonna close the stream down now. Thank you for watching, everyone. Hope it was an entertaining and possibly informative conversation.